house with his cousin and a few other friends. And these were children having a good time. And the police then claimed that, stray bullets are the ones that hit him, despite the fact that they were in the house and the house was sprayed, and there were a whole lot of shootings in this favela that they were staying in Brazil. And what then happened is that after the police shot him, the aunt who had been at the market had run back home, and she found that there was a pool of blood, but they had taken the boy's body and flown it to Rio, without the family's permission. So the police had helicopters. They shot a 14-year-old. They took the body and they went, and then the family only found out where he was a good 24 hours later. So there are protests in Brazil. And also, of course, there is the case that the Brazilian president is very right-wing right now in the midst of a pandemic where the poor are often staying together and more likely to get the disease. There is also, Brazil hasn't had a minister of health since April. They've got like some military guy who's been military doctor who's been axing since April. So there are all those things, and it's the most affected country with the pandemic in Latin America. And of course, majority of the people who are vulnerable to it are usually the poor. So it has brought all these things to the fore, not just in Brazil. Over here, I've been writing about the women at my gate for the last few weeks. Generally, we have these women come. I live in an estate, so these women come. They sit at the gate, and people will get them to come and do the laundry, iron the laundry, whatever it is, clean the houses. But because of the pandemic, a lot of people are uncomfortable now having them in the house. So these women still come and they still hope. And I've always wondered, I questioned in my very first piece, as soon as I thought about it and I went outside, I said, what happens when hope dies? What happened? And this is what we're seeing now in the rest of the world. The poor start rioting. The poor will eat the rich. The poor will say no more, And this is the seed of this thing that's happening. People are saying, when the next thing that we're going to have to do in future is it's going to have to change drastically. They will go on.
You see it as a kind of revolutionary moment. No, Nana, I'm in Los Angeles. You wanted to say something about
the coronavirus. I wanted to say something about, I wanted to also add a response to what you were asking. I think that, first of all, a lot of these so-called first world nations, their response to the pandemic was shocking. They were shockingly unprepared. And, for a country like the United States to only have a little under 1 million hospital beds, that's all they have in the United States of America. And for them to not have ventilators, things like that. And then to also start to see where the pandemic was really hitting hardest. Black people are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So what you're seeing is not just, I think the police brutality was basically, it was the very last straw. You're also dealing with people who are fed up because of the implicit bias that exists in healthcare, in housing, in employment. All of this systemic racism is, rising to the core. And it's interesting because, when you talk about the effect on a global level, a lot of people are echoing this because, as we've said in this conversation, it occurs in their own societies. But we're looking at, let's say, yesterday was the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, So you're looking at the fact that this is happening all over the world. It is echoing. And right now, as a lot of these countries, like the Brazilian president, like the American president, are moving farther right. And then also, as we're seeing basically what is a really disgusting and failed experiment, capitalism, and we're seeing the result of that, where so many people, well, so few people, I should say, have such tremendous wealth, and so many people have so little or are just struggling for basic things, medicine. I mean, look at something like Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who's the richest man in the world and is set to become the world's first trillionaire. His employees do not have health care. So what does that mean? That somebody who has that much wealth can't afford to give his employees something as basic as health care. And so I think that people are starting to get really angry. And indeed, one of the conversations that you see taking place right now is people will say online, if you go to any of the social media, you'll see that people are angry about the looting and the destruction of property. And then you'll see the responses where people will say, a man died, people are dying, and you're caring about material possessions. And so there's that whole kind of, discussion of what is the value of human life? Where are our priorities right now? These are human beings that are being disposed of as if, they're nothing at all. And who are you to say? I mean, the United States president spoke inside the Rose Garden and said, I am an ally to all peaceful protesters. And then as he was speaking, his police and military forces were shooting unarmed peaceful protesters to clear the path outside of the White House so that he could cross the street to hold up a Bible upside down at a church that didn't invite him, that did not want him. And in fact, one of the people who was tear gassed was a clergy member of the church. Who was outside. And so he held up this Bible, did not open it, did not pray, held up a Bible, took photographs, and walked back across the street. We are having these kinds of conversations where people are then asking, if you would open the Bible, if you knew the Bible, you would know that Jesus was a rebel. Jesus was a protester. And
right.
So, these are the conversations that are taking place, is what is real and what is a photo op, and what is just spin? What is somebody sitting in a room saying, how do we manage this? How do we make it so you look good, as opposed to dealing with the real problem?
I just wanted to say that it's baffling because at the beginning of the pandemic, if you remember, there was this whole discourse about we are all in it together, and everybody is suffering, and basically this is a common human disaster. And suddenly we see that, in fact, that this pandemic has unearthed inequalities. I mean, the sense of profound inequalities in the world, sometimes within one country and also between countries. And this is, I think, the big lesson that we get. And there is the need for change. And I think that this global press against police brutality, against police brutality geared on black people, is also a way of resisting a system that is not responding to the needs of the majority of the people anymore. And we've got to go back to the real issues also, which are very much linked to the environment and to the climate issue. I think that we will have to go back to this. I see, Paul, I see myself as a writer, as an artist. A lot of people are starting a kind of resistance. And that's what is happening, is resistance against a system that is not able to deliver to the majority of the people anymore.
And can we just talk briefly about the climate? You mentioned climate, and I think that's such an important thing, because being locked up for many months, being locked down, I should say, not locked up, but being locked down in one's home for many months, many weeks, we saw that the climate changed. Mm-hmm. The earth started, geologists were saying that the earth was vibrating at a different frequency even, in terms of the noise, because there was no vehicular traffic. Mm-hmm. Everything just sort of stopped, and the skies cleared. It was as if everything that everyone had been saying could not be done was suddenly done immediately as soon as the pandemic came in.
Veronique, I wanted to ask you about the political response to this in Africa. I mean, you've spoken about the need for political change and change in environment policy and so on. We've had these condemnations of the US criminal justice system from the African Union, from various governments. The president of Ghana has made a statement about systemic racism in the US. What do you think African governments, but also African political movements, should be doing at this time? How can they seize this moment and use it to make progressive change?
I think you're talking about civil society, because in terms of the governments, we're in a tight corner here, because what is no, it's true, because what is happening in our countries in general is not really something that you want to replicate. So it's difficult for African government truly to can give lessons to anybody. What we have to do is really push the African Union to be more active inside the continent and outside as well. But that's for the long run. But civil society needs to be stronger, much stronger. I've always thought that there is a political class that is not doing its job. It's the middle class in Africa in general. They are able, they have privileges, they are able to see what's going on in the world, what's going on inside their country, but somehow the political atmosphere is not letting them express themselves, or let's say they're frightened of anything, of doing anything, because everything is political in Africa. The environmental issue is political in Africa. Everything you touch is political. So I think we've got to work around this and find a voice to really apply pressure on our governments.
How do you think that could happen? I mean, will it be these social movements? Because if you look at the big political change, say, over the last decade in Africa, whether it's Tunisia, whether it's Libya, Egypt, and the pressure for change in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on, it doesn't seem to be coming from the established parties. In fact, in most cases, the big political changes have come from protest movements, social movements against the established order, not just the ruling party, but the business elite that has prospered from that ruling party. How do you see, what are the vehicles for political change, do you think, in Africa now?
Yeah, it's a big question, because yes. I think we are disillusioned with, the political parties. Sometimes someone new or what we think, who we think is new, comes in, and after a while it's back to the same problems of, corruption, lack of funding in the health system. I think so somewhere, we as artists, economists, there is a need to get some sort of a coalition and a Pan-African coalition. I know that in the letter, in the Afrolit letter, there is the